Welcome to Economics Happy Hour. My name's Matt,
And my name is Jadrian.
and we are thrilled to have you with us in mid-May. Semester completely, officially over at Susquehanna University, at least, not quite with Virginia Tech, I can tell by that reaction.
Yeah, we're close. I posted grades yesterday, so that means this week I am responding to emails about the grades that I had posted. We commence the semester on Friday, but it's also looking like rain is supposed to happen on Friday. But by the time people are listening to this, yes, the semester is fully
Yeah.
over for Virginia Tech.
Yeah, and I had two commencements, one in the family and one for SU
You've been
last
busy.
week. So it was a lot of commencements, which uh, all good. Happy to see people move on and some good stuff. So, well, we have a timely topic for once for everybody to talk about. Actually, not for once, for twice, two in a row. A timely topic. Last
We're getting
time
good at this, and we even
the
recorded
Tonys.
early, and this
This
is
is
still
this
timely.
is recording a week early. It is May 13th as we're recording, but I think this is still pretty timely by the time people will hear it. We have a new pope. And the Pope, I know the first thing everybody thinks about when they think about a new Pope is, well, what are the economics behind this? But you had a great article in the Monday Economist. Oh, you're looking at the beer. I'm forgetting the beer part. So let's pause on our Pope
We probably
talk
should
and
have had
drink
wine.
beer.
Maybe we should have
We
themed
should have
this
had,
better.
yeah, communion wine for what's the beer of the day?
I can go first.
Go
Friend
for
got
it.
me this. My friend Steve, from a neighboring brewery close to Matt.
New
I don't
Trail,
have a little new
Will,
trail.
Williamsport.
I gotta be real careful with this one. It is a tropical double broken heels double hazy IPA. And the reason I said I have to be careful with this one is it is a 9.2%.
Broken Heels is a good beer, and Double Broken Heels is a strong beer.
So there's a good chance that after 45 minutes, Matt, I will not have finished this beer, but we'll see how I feel in about 30 to 35 minutes.
We might have to have this one might have to go in the archives for when have you had an IPA and I've had a citrus wheat.
We flipped roles here. I will say
Mill
this is
Street
very
Brew,
lemony.
yep, Beer Street, or I'm sorry, Beer Street, Mill Street Brewery, which I believe this is an Ontario brewery. I had a trip up to Canada in mid-March and I was driving, so naturally I had to stop at the beer store on the way back and brought it back. I'm not certain if I'm technically allowed or I was supposed to
Ooh, that was my
declare, but
next question. I go, are you allowed to bootleg alcohol?
I made it through. So I don't know. I don't know if that's officially allowed or not. I think I
You're a
might have mentioned to
bootlegger.
the guy I did make a stop at the beer store, but I don't know. It's Canada. They love beer. So although I don't think it's the Canadian who's checking me on the way back in, it would have been the American, but they they didn't.
They didn't
For
mind.
whatever reason, I made it through.
Those trips are wild. So
Yeah.
you're going Canadian today,
Going with the Canadian beer.
despite our very first Pope being an American.
Hey,
That can be our weird transition into the topic.
hey, this is the insert the 51st state joke here. So,
Hey,
right, like,
let's make sure we're all on this. Let's level set ourselves here. Let's make sure we're all on the same page. Are you Catholic?
I'm not Catholic.
Okay, I'm
Although
not Catholic either. So we
I
need to be
did,
very careful about if we say something dumb about Catholicism, just know
please
that Matt
correct
and I are
us.
not Catholics.
Yeah, I did. I have probably a bit less of an excuse because I guess, kind of raised Catholic.
Okay.
Went through the first communion. I went to a Catholic school from third grade to seventh grade. So and then we moved to a public school and we started going to a non-Catholic church
Mhm.
after that. So I kind of I know a few of the intricacies, but certainly not as well as many people would, well, as most Catholics would know
I'll
the
say it's on the Catholic
intricacies.
side. I don't know people, but this is
Um,
hazy.
well,
This is
cheers.
actually really good. Cheers. I'm still focused on this. It's very lemony, very orange. I need to slow down. We should have had Brian Holler on since he's at a Catholic university and he's an economist.
He, he
I don't think he's Catholic, but
he can chime in and correct he can come up with a mistake meter and we'll put this on here.
he
So
should just fact check us. We should have him listen. He can live listen to the episode. We record him, and anytime almost like when we did the presidential debates, he can pause it and go, "Okay, here's what Matt and Jadrian are doing wrong."
yeah, yeah. The list I'm sure would be many, so that would be a long episode. So Uh, the Catholic Church cardinal from the United States making history. First time there will be a U.S. Pope. It's kind of crazy, growing up, you know, haven't had that many popes, right? It was for me, it was Pope John
Oh,
Paul
in our
II for a
lives,
long
yes.
time. Yeah,
You meant-
in our lifetime.
okay.
Yeah. Pope John Paul II was just this larger than life figure when I was a kid. And part of it was like from Poland and it's the Cold War and all of the symbolism that goes with that. And so I've always thought of, I guess it had never occurred to me as a kid that the Pope could actually maybe be an American someday. The thought never crossed my mind. And
So
yet
I
we have
will,
one now.
yes. I think the only time I realized how weird it was, and I'm in the same boat, right? So I knew the Pope John Paul. That was right as a kid. I knew that he was the Pope. Um, I did not realize until the most recent Pope, Pope Francis, that the Pope could even not be a European. I think that was also, I think just in my mind, again, I know nothing about Catholicism, so any of our Catholic listeners will probably laugh at us for all the mistakes we make in this space. I just assumed the Pope had to be European. It just sort of made sense in my mind. Um,
Yeah, well, I
but
mean, that
I never
was,
considered that an American Pope would be a weird thing, I guess, after Francis was selected.
yeah, and I mean, kind of makes sense in this, and I suspect the vast majority was Pope Francis the first non-European Pope.
As you
That
can
I don't
tell,
know.
we am not prepared for this.
We do not know. Yeah, we put it in our typical preparation on this. So the Pope Francis passed away in just a few weeks ago, late April. Was it, I think, the day after Easter? April 21st, I believe, was the date. The Pope Francis passed away. And then there's the voting for the new pope. And this is where your Monday Morning Economist article I thought was quite interesting. Do you want to give a quick summary of what prompted you to think, I want to write about the voting for the Pope for the Monday Economist?
Easy answer. My prompt was Noah Trudeau at Troy University had messaged me and he said, "Hey man, are you going to write about the Pope for Monday Morning Economist?" And I replied to him and I said, "I would love to. I don't know what to write about. I have thought about it. He messaged me sort of early on in the week, so I
Yeah.
had thought about it. And usually, if there's a topic, I'll start thinking about it, and then something will come up. And then he is actually the one who had told me. He said, "Hey, you should write about sort of the economics of." Voting rules, majority, supermajority, and then he had basically plopped the calculus of consent nugget for Buchanan and Tulloch and said you could talk about internal costs and decision making cost. And I go, that sounds like an amazing topic. Let me stew on it for a few days, and then I sent it to him and made sure I had him. He was my proofreader on Saturday. I said, hey, here's what I've got so far. How wildly off am I? And he said that it looked good. So then I spent Sunday sort of cleaning it up. So I'll
Awesome.
give full credit to Noah. He was the one that had dropped the voting side of it on there.
Yeah, and it's pretty fascinating the actual rules on it. So you have popes from all over the world who are coming in, and you had a nice little chart in your article, which we'll
Mm.
post in the show notes, or we'll link to the article at least in the show notes, the ideological map of the College of Cardinals. And it is this college that's the voter, right? Each cardinal gets one vote in the conclave, we assume.
Eligible cardinals. So I
Okay.
did learn that not all cardinals are eligible out of the College of Cardinals. You have to be a certain age. You have to be physically in the Vatican, so some of them can't travel. So it's sort of a subset of the
Okay.
sort of the full college. They're the ones that get to vote.
And when you saw the ideological map of the Cardinals, was there anything that kind of jumped out to you on this?
So I had actually already known this. The reason I squeezed this in here because that's where Noah's recommendation was really good because I had listened to I want to probably a NPR podcast like right after Pope Francis had died, either NPR or one of the other ones that was talking about who would replace the Pope. That was a big, I mean, that feels like that's a very obvious topic for like NPR or the New York Times to talk about in their podcast. And it was actually in that podcast that I had heard about this sort of internal church debate over political philosophy around at least so they use the terms conservative and liberal popes, but they mean it in a church setting, not in a political setting
Sure,
of
sure.
just this idea of like should priests be allowed to marry? Should we have women in the conclave? Things like
Priesthood, yeah.
that. And they were doing this sort of big debate of basically where would they go and would they focus on bringing more people into the church or would they focus on sort of interpreting the book like sort of conservative Catholicism. So that's where I had first heard about it. And then as I was reading Buchanan's Calculus of Consent, and they were talking about this idea that as parties become more diverse and that it's harder to get people to agree. I was very thankful that I had listened to that podcast because it was very easy to connect those two together. That when you have people who don't all agree on the same thing, it might be hard to get them to sort of choose one leader.
And yeah, so the looking at this, it's a rainbow of colors, and there's, goes they go from liberal, soft liberal, moderate, or ambiguous, soft conservative, conservative in terms. And looking at that map, it doesn't look like, I mean, even three, you need three groups together
Hmm.
essentially to get to what is a supermajority, the two-thirds vote in order to elect a pope, which seems rather daunting. So another point you mentioned here, were you had you started to write this before the vote came through?
Mm. I had started to write it. So Noah gave me the idea before they started voting, and I was actually turn. I didn't under when he dropped the recommendation because he hadn't sort of like given me like his trinket. He was just like, "Oh, do you want to write about the Pope?" And I had responded. And I said, "I would love to, but I don't want this to be that I write about something, and then like what I'm writing isn't true." I was scared that it was going to be one of those who should they pick? Oh, it's super easy to come up with this idea, and then it was going to take like 2 weeks for them to pick a pope. So I was nervous in that sense. And then basically they had selected the pope early enough that I had not started the article, and so then I was like,
Okay.
oh, this is super easy then.
Um, so I was going to ask if, given what you'd seen, if you were surprised in
Mm,
who and how quick it was. But you may not
not
have.
really. So I think that was part of the fun part is I trying to think of who it was that had done this. I think the Associated Press had put out a chart of like how long it took each pope to be selected. And
Mhm.
then I had found a shorter one that was just like what the pope since the 1900s. And then I don't remember who had the other one. Maybe the New York Times had like
Sure.
the history of like every pope and how long they had been selected. And some of them took like months to be selected.
Well, it was a trivia question
Okay.
and I'll ask this if you don't know it for sure, but in approximate number of days, how many days what was the longest it ever took for a new pope to be chosen? Like
I
the
feel like I remember the number being really big, like in like today's like compared to what we have now. I want to say it was something like 250, 260. I was like, I feel like I remember it being very large, but
yeah, and
if you know
I
the
actually
answers,
without the days, it's actually closer to 1,000.
1,000.
It's
Okay.
November 1268 to September 1271, so close to
Yeah.
3 years. So about approximately 1,000 days. That was one of the tiebreaker trivia questions at our
Yeah.
weekly trivia night at Marzoni's.
I probably should have checked with Noah to ask him if he was if he was Catholic and how he knew these things that he was telling me, because he had read the previous one and he had made a comment that I don't have it in my part, but apparently the sort of the current version of the popes is they all have to stay in the Vatican until, or the Sistine Chapel. They have to stay together until a pope is selected. But that sort of historically they were allowed to go home and come back. They
Okay.
weren't sort of locked under key in the
Yeah.
olden days, and so it did take much longer because basically some of them wouldn't come back, and then some of them would be delayed, and like there was no rush to select a pope. But
Yeah.
now that they're all sort of locked together,
They
they
couldn't
they
just
sort
hop
of
on
skip.
an airplane to get over as well and, like, oh, be there in 24 hours and
But you know
here's
what
your
it reminded me of? It reminded me of, and I hadn't thought about it in the moment. I guess I could have written about this before, but when the House Speaker was selected,
Hmm.
whenever they voted out, well, before Mike Johnson, whoever it was before, where it was like
Sure.
taking them multiple rounds to get through. To be fair, that's only a majority, but in some senses, you sort of need given our current Congress, you sort of need a super majority of the majority party in order to be selected as
Yeah.
House
Yeah.
Speaker. And I was thinking about these like multiple rounds. And I remember like when that happened before, just how awkward that had to have been. That like you would put somebody up and a chunk would vote and then they'd go, "Nope, we don't want you," and then you'd lose to someone else. But I don't know. I don't think they're the same way in the Pope setting. Um,
Yeah. No, it's kind of fascinating. So your article, I mean, you're discussing like the voting rules and how it happens, and you really seem to be defending, you can correct me if I'm wrong, defending the two-thirds rule for voting for a pope. And I don't know that I necessarily even disagree with that, but I'm hoping if I'm getting your sentiment correct, I'm hoping you can maybe expand for the listeners why is the two-thirds majority important for selecting a pope?
I think it is important. I don't think a simple majority is enough. Given that it is a, and this is going to turn, we could turn this into political leaders of our own parties. Um, really important decisions should have super majorities. I don't know that a 50% plus one is appropriate when you have the Pope is a big visible person within the church. So even though I'm not
Yeah,
Catholic, plenty of non-Catholics know who the Pope is, and I think know the importance of the Pope.
sure.
And given that, actually the way that you sort of framed it before, right? You do have these all these ideological differences in the church, um, which could pivot. I mean, a pope is a lifetime appointment minus
Yeah,
one that stepped down. Close to a lifetime appointment. In some senses, I think you do want to make sure that it's somebody that a larger than the majority would agree should be able to serve for a long period of time. And so, actually, maybe I'm going to backtrack on my own statement. Is maybe in our political system, 50 plus one is enough because there's term limits, and if you're not happy with that person, you can pick a new person in 4 years. But with a pope, and especially this pope, he's relatively young.
yeah.
You're not picking a new pope for another 20 years. I think it should be somebody that is more than half support in that position.
The no, I think you're right, and you've got all of these disparate factions. And if it's a two-thirds majority that goes through, I mean, at least, well, at a minimum, about 67%, and likely probably a couple points higher. I mean, you never know. It could be exactly 66.7%, but it probably was 72, 74, 78% by the time they get to this vote. That's a good chunk of people who feel good about this. So I think I agree for something this big that makes a lot of sense and lifetime appointment. The other part, if you don't want that, let's say you really didn't think this should have been the Pope. I mean, you might not be happy about the what ended up happening, but you certainly don't know that the person just skated through. Like,
Yes. No.
if it's 70% voting for it, okay, you lost. You didn't really want that, but okay, it was you can't complain about the rules of the game in
Well,
essence.
I mean, in some senses, you always think about the voice of the minority, but the voice of the small group is very different when the small group is 48% versus like 14%. When
Correct,
you are
correct.
truly part of a even smaller group of people who are unhappy with the choice, I think
Yeah,
I wonder if my answer would be different if they were not so like ideologically different. But given that there are so many different factions, the idea that the majority of those different factions agreed and said this one's okay.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. I liked in the article. I liked your comparing to the U.S. rules that don't require that require super majorities, which
right. I mean,
you
imagine if an amendment was just a simple majority.
oh, what a mess, right? I mean, it should be. I mean, we can have all sorts of law changes, and those can be through the process, which is already somewhat difficult, but requires the House, the Senate, the President all to sign off. But it only requires 50% plus one, right, in the
Mhm.
House and 50% plus one in the Senate, along with the President. But overriding a presidential veto requires two-thirds from both chambers. And yeah, amending the Constitution, two-thirds of Congress plus three-fourths of the states. It's no wonder why we don't get too many amendments.
Yeah.
And when we do, they're pretty big deals and they are agreed upon.
You know, what was really interesting was one of the very first comments that I had gotten on this article that I had not thought about when I was writing it. But one of the first comments basically just said, "Did you use internal costs and external costs on purpose? Because this feels like an externality story." And I had not even considered that aspect of it.
Hmm.
Right, if a group of two-thirds of people are picking a decision, that
Yeah.
is imposing a cost on the other third that has to deal with whatever the decision of the group is that they did not vote for. And I had
Yeah.
never thought about, so this is Greg. I only know Greg's first name based on the comment. But it was such an interesting perspective that I had not thought about it from this sort of externality story of that a group is imposing a cost on somebody else who did not want what was selected.
Yeah, and it's a weird, like when teaching externalities, it took me a long time to try to get my head around this idea and saying, well, of course, like if some new business opens up and they can offer a product that's cheaper than my family's product, right? That's an externality on me. I'm
Hmm.
like, well, yeah, it's a side effect. It's affecting you, but a little bit of the question comes, what did you have the right to?
Yes.
And it honestly it took me a long time to kind of figure that out. Yeah, you don't have the right to have people buy from you on a product. You might, like there in contrast to saying, the pollutant, like, you might have the right to clean air
Yeah.
on that front. We could in externalities and when should something happen on
I,
that.
I struggled with the same thing when I was teaching labor because one of the externalities that it gives is things like when migration happens and people move into an area, your wages go down. That's a pecuniary externality. I'm like, is that really the same? Like, it was that same
Yeah.
sort of like, right? The idea is there's an increase in supply, so everybody's wages go down. And I was like,
Yeah,
I've
yeah.
never thought of that as an externality. Like, that's not. I mean, the
I
argument, right, is
would.
that one person moves, they made a private decision to move, and then it had third party effects. And I was like, that feels different, but it's probably like, I guess like there's these sort of interesting concepts that we talk about things that when they're applied to other situations, they feel very different than
Yep,
sort of
yep,
their
I agree.
intention.
I agree. So on the Pope front, and you reminded me that I had commented on the movie Conclave about
Yes.
6 months ago and telling everybody I'm going to be recording clips from this because there's so much cool voting games stuff in there. So I teach voting games in game theory, and I always think it's a wildly fun section to teach because part of what I think is fun is you can set up scenarios where you can say, here's the preferences of there's like simple ones to say like there's three clubs in school, a French club, a Spanish club, and a German club in the US, right? Like they study the different languages. And there's three candidates for potential election. Well, you could get a different result if you have a plurality rules vote, which
Hmm.
is just saying, hey, you take one vote and whoever gets the most, doesn't matter if it's a majority, whoever gets the most wins. You can get different results from that versus a result that says if you don't have a majority after round one, we're going to start dropping people off, and then we'll see who gets like, so if the third place would get knocked off and then we'd revote, and of the two you could get different candidates, same exact people, same exact preferences, but the actual rules of voting matter. And the students always find this fascinating, and I actually tie it to the student government, which,
Hmm.
Susquehanna is a campus of 2100. I'm like, how does the student government choose their leaders? Is it a plurality rules or is it a majority rules? Because that actually could lead to a different student being SGA president on this, which is, there are a few times you share things and the students, you almost see their mouths open like, this is wild, and that's one of them that I've remembered seeing. So I found that movie pretty crazy. It goes into a lot of voting rules, which is interesting. And
Yeah.
yeah.
So one of my favorite voting sort of example, I don't know if you tell me if this is the right way to phrase this example concept,
Yeah.
is the Condorcet paradox,
Yeah.
which I absolutely love. So those of you who are not nearly as nerdy about voting rules, the idea behind it is that if you have a majority rules voting system, that people have different preferences over what they're voting on. So not like a US system where there's only two choices. If you have three choices or multiple choices, that basically you could do a majority rules voting system, but that people will still not be able to pick a winner. You can have basically like a three-way tie
Yeah.
between them, even if you have sort of a narrow set of options. Did I explain that, I guess, in a good way? I
I
think the
don't,
example is
so
always three voters, three options,
the
depending on
way
how
that
they
I've
rank them.
explained, I mean, I've taught, and I've always,
Oh,
and
good.
so this is where I've said it's Condorcet rule. I don't know
Oh,
for sure. That's what I've always taught this. So
that
that
sounds
rule,
right because I think it's French. So you
yeah. So
probably
if
are
a
saying it
candidate
correct.
satisfies the Condorcet rule, um, if there is a candidate, it happens. So if there is a candidate who would always beat everybody else head to head, the Condorcet rule says that person should win in a
Hmm.
multi-person race. Not all elections. So in my game theory, and if any of my students are listening now, I'm guessing not many. I'm teaching it in the fall, but I'll put in the question: um, Is the winner is the winner the Condorcet candidate, or did the winner follow the Condor? It's sometimes they might, but sometimes they will. But you could have a case where you have a candidate who's knocked out, maybe they would get 60% in against anybody, but only really 10% love the person. And so they in a four-way race, they get knocked out. And then the Condorcet candidate doesn't win. That's the way I think I've thought of that.
And it's always just been fascinating to me, right? Is that I think that goes into the idea of you can have a majority, but the majority doesn't win in every case too.
Yeah.
You have these sort of weird examples. No, I think the voting stuff is always super fascinating to me. I've never taken a course in social choice or public choice or anything like that. And so I get to learn about it sort of in weird pieces. And I think I first learned about it when I was actually writing the Parks and Rec book. I think I had a
Yeah.
section in there because this is actually a shockingly shockingly specific example in Parks and maybe I should have saved this for my pop culture, but I can
We can count it as the pop culture
Yeah,
early.
I'll mention it now and then I'll say this is my pop culture from later, where a group of them are trying to figure out where to go eat and they are debating between whether they should get steak or breakfast or somewhere else, and they cannot come up with a decision because essentially they've all ranked them in this sort of goofy way that there's no clear majority in the
Yeah,
system.
yeah. No, so what's interesting to think, like Pope Leo won based on the rules of the game. But if the rules were slightly different, if they had a system where everybody places a vote and the lowest person is knocked out, maybe Leo's knocked out first
Hmm.
if they're not meeting to do this because maybe only 10% of people really loved Pope Leo. And everybody else is okay with Pope Leo, but they all had their favorites. Well, then Pope Leo gets knocked out. But the way the rules were set up, Pope Leo wins. And in fact, it's almost certain there is some set of rules that could have been applied, whether it is majority rule, whether it is an initial plurality rule. I
Hmm.
mean, it did take them several votes, right? We know it took, was it 4 votes? I think it took within I
Oh,
think you had that
yeah, I
in
think
your
so.
article.
It's three or four. Well, and this always I think is the most interesting part is we do have some data on the first round of results. The Cardinals are not supposed to tell what the vote totals are. So I learned a lot about the voting process. So the way that it works is each Cardinal is given a little wooden ball, and then they write the who they're voting for on a ballot, and then they go and basically turn it in. They turn in the ball and the ballot so
Yeah.
that they make sure that it's being counted once. I also learned that they like stick a piece of string through it. Like there's all this sort of ornate pageantry related stuff. But essentially, what happens is that they count all the balls and then they count all the votes, and then they have certain titles for who the leaders of it are, but I don't know these titles very well. But basically, one person reads it, another person reads it, and then a third person announces the name of who was selected. So they read off every vote, and then somebody else is keeping track of who votes.
Hmm.
And so we
Yeah.
do know because the Cardinals are supposed to keep it secret, but they do. Some of them do like leak out like who were like who was the lead in the beginning. And I think this was the thing that surprised most people with Pope Leo is that he was. I don't think he was even considered sort of in the first round. Like that he was not. He was not one of the like top vote getters in the very beginning. And
Yeah.
so there are some cardinal who is speaking on anonymity. has shared sort of like who was the initial leaders of like the first round of stuff, and it's interesting because the one of the articles I had read was one of the one of the cardinals' names was spelled wrong on one of the votes, so it counted as like a they were having this sort of internal church debate of like they could clearly tell who it was supposed to be for, but it was spelled wrong. And so it was that sort of classic like the write-in candidate. I mean, they're all writing
Yeah,
them
yeah.
down, but should you count one that's close or not, and things like that. So
That's
yeah,
pretty
Pope
funny.
Leo was not in the was not an early contender. We don't know we don't know
No.
what changed and why they decided to change their mind away from somebody else. But whoever was sort of in that first round did not get selected and then did not make it in later rounds.
Yeah, I mean, it really is fascinating. And the students we go through when I teach, like we go through the analytics and they learn the analytics. But if I'm hoping that there's a take-home message that 10 years from the time of the class they might remember from that, it is
Mhm.
that a different set of voting rules could lead to a different person actually winning the election. And here that might have happened. And it doesn't mean Leo's not the right candidate, right? Everybody ended up
Yeah.
agreeing. Maybe
Well,
wasn't the first
a
choice for a lot.
supermajority agreed.
Yeah, a
We don't know the final
supermajority.
vote.
Not
Not
everybody, but not everybody, but
right, but I think
probably not everybody.
this is a really good example, right? Especially what I wrote in the article is if you wanted essentially no dissension, you could set the rules at unanimity. You could say you have to have a unanimous vote of all the cardinals, and I could not even imagine how long that would take.
Yeah.
Just to get all 100 something on board to agree to something, they would take absolutely. We basically wouldn't have a pope. I feel like there'd always be some holdout who's like, no, I'm not going to vote for that person,
Yeah, yeah.
my person or no
Uh,
one.
um, no, so it's thought it's pretty fascinating. It was a great article.
Thank you.
I would imagine most people who listen are familiar with the Monday Economist, but
Well, Matt, I want to follow up with what we talked about in the beginning. I did, while we were talking, get data on the popes and the history of the pope and where they come from.
awesome.
There have been 267 popes throughout history. 200 of them were born in what we now consider Italy. So most popes are Italian. There have been two popes from the Americas, Francis and Leo, so South America and North America. There have been three from Africa, but
Okay,
I looked it up on a different. I was looking at a bunch of different places. It was part of the Roman Empire part, right? So it's the northern part of Africa that's part of the Roman Empire, so not like sort of truly what we know today as Africa.
sure, sure.
And then there have been eight popes that are from the Middle East, but same sort of idea. They were from Jerusalem. Like, so it's, yes,
The-
it's the Middle East, but
Yeah,
it's not
yeah.
the Middle East that most of us know today.
Okay. No, thanks for
So
finding
two,
that.
he is the second American pope.
Second
Well,
American Pope and second in a row. Pope from the Americas, I
pope
guess,
from
if
the
we want to
Thank you. Yeah, that's probably going to frustrate somebody if I said that. So
be
good
clear
catch.
about that. Any final thoughts on the Pope and the election of the Pope to share, other
No, Matt,
than
but I do have a question. Maybe this is, I don't know, maybe I should have primed you from this before. Could you think of a majority voting rule that you think would be better as a supermajority rule? Or I'll let you go the other direction. Is there a supermajority rule that you're aware of that you think would be better as a majority rule?
a good question?
Just made it up on the spot. So this is
Yeah, I might without thinking much on this, and this is probably reflects my bias. I would think a lot of law changes that put in new restrictions, like if you're going to put in restrictions on whatever, if you're
Mhm.
essentially restricting some people's
Any
rights on
regulation.
something,
Yeah, yeah.
most things, I could make a pretty good argument it shouldn't be a 50 plus 50.1% rule. It should, or 50% plus one, that it should be a little bit higher. That then so
Is
that's my
a filibuster in the
quick thought.
Senate is not supermajority. It's 60.
It's still 50 for the Senate. However, then there's the rules. Can they, you
Can they
know,
end, sorry, ending a filibuster.
filibuster, ending the filibuster, right? Doesn't that take 60 votes to end a filibuster or
Yeah.
something? And so it makes it a little bit trickier. And I think they used to call ending a filibuster when you went up and talked, and now they'll just say, "Hey, we're going to say there's a filibuster on this." And,
Cloture. Oh no, cloture is a two-thirds majority. Interesting.
um, so That
Well,
that would
here's
be
what I
my
was gonna.
advice. How about
Yeah.
flipping it back to you? Can you
Well,
think of any?
this is where I was going with this. Is I'm curious if I don't. There's a problem. I'm going to say this. I'm going to say this, and I don't know that this is actually necessarily true, but in the same sense that passing a budget, for example. But then I think about this and I go, it would take them a lot longer to pass a budget if it required 60%, 67%. And then we
Yeah,
wouldn't get a budget. And then we'd have we only require 51 right now, and they still shut down every 7 months, it feels like. I
yeah,
don't know that it's actually necessarily a good idea that we would need 67%, but in some senses, I think it's in that same space. I think one of the most annoying things is this idea that Congress sort of every 2 years just flips back and forth on budget things. But I'm gonna say that's my contribution, but I don't know that I actually agree with it.
yeah. I
I just
haven't.
don't think we'd have any budget passed.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and I haven't. It's a great question. I mean, it's a
Well, it's sort
fantastic
of like if
question
you're
because I
gonna
hadn't
spend
thought
my
about
money,
it.
if you're gonna spend our money on something, I want
Yeah,
to have broad agreement on what you're spending money on.
yeah, because five districts in five swing districts went one way versus the other. It shouldn't wildly affect the way the budget is in one particular year,
Right? And
one way or the other, right?
you won't drop in these weird pork items to get you above the
Yeah,
simple majority. Maybe.
yeah.
I assume you wouldn't care as much about converting one person over by promising some sort of
Well, or maybe you need to do more of that junk, though. That's the flip side. I hadn't thought about, if you need 67%, does that mean there has to be more pork projects for the various districts so that everybody's happy and say, okay, if you promise me a new, we're gonna NASA is going to expand to Omaha, so as the representative from Omaha, now I will vote yes. Um, I I I
I don't
don't know
know.
that that
You have
will
to think about it.
happen, but
There's somebody out there who is much more knowledgeable than us about
yeah.
this. So I'm curious what they
Yeah,
think.
and I will for those listening, if we got anything wrong or if you know the papal voting process or the Catholic Church much better than we do, which probably isn't that difficult and want to chime in, please send us a note, write a comment, all of that good stuff. So you mentioned you gave a pop culture example, Parks and Rec.
Given
I
my that's my contribution. I was gonna
Yeah.
say you could go real easy and say conclave if you wanted to.
I already said Conclave, so I will go to a different
Okay.
one that won't surprise you if I'm not going to come, if I'm doing a fallback, it's often going to a Broadway song. And Hamilton, the election of 1800 in Hamilton is a pretty fascinating, I think, song. And it was really kind of a fascinating election in general, but
Hmm.
it had to go to the House of Representatives and they ended in a tie between Jefferson and Burr. And Hamilton's influence is credited with swinging it towards Thomas Jefferson, who he didn't really agree with much, but it just shows how much he hated Aaron Burr, who, later decided to shoot him. Minor details, right? But
Small,
um,
yeah. I think that's just it's a footnote in American history. I think.
just yeah. So it's a good song for anybody to if you're teaching elections and or teaching voting and want to put a song on before you're teaching that, election of 1800 is a good one. So.
If you are a trivia person, maybe this will come up in trivia. So, Matt, I'll drop a little trivia just because I happen to scroll down
Please.
on Wikipedia. The last pope elected from outside of Europe before Francis. So, right, do you
Okay.
know sort of? So, right, you got Francis and then a
Yep.
bunch of Europeans. Do you know the last pope that was not European?
I do not.
Pope Gregory the Third from 731 to 741 was the last pope from outside of Europe selected until Pope Francis.
731. Okay. Yeah, I wasn't around then. So
Pope Greg, if you Pope Greg the Third, if
Pope
you
Greg the Third.
that feels like a trivia question, right? Because I think
That's a great trivia question.
there's only
That's
so
a
many
great
pope
trivia.
names. Pope Greg the Third. You just have to remember to write Gregory,
Yeah.
otherwise they might
Yeah,
catch
after
you.
this, I'm actually going to trivia right after we're done. So if they ask that, I will add an addendum to the end of this episode too.
I hope they ask you a pope question of like how long is like the longest amount of time, and you can also just like weave in and be like the previous just start
Yeah, all of the stuff, all of the stuff. So
adding other ones.
how,
All right,
so how
Matt.
much of the double
No,
IPA? Oh,
about half. I'm gonna
okay.
have a little bit more, but I am getting close to the bottom of this.
Yeah. I,
It's, kick,
I've
it's kicking
I've
in.
done well with this orange citrus wheat, which was a delicious beer. Not my usual type of beer, but very good beer. And but it was not a 9% beer, so
I can feel my cheeks getting a little pinker, so I gotta slow
hey,
down.
that's okay. But well, thank you to everybody for listening. Once again, comments, likes, recommendations, all of the things, they help us out. So if you wanted to say, a great way to say thank you is to try to leave a comment, leave a 5-star review, all of the stuff. We also appreciate show ideas. So I guess a huge thank you to Noah, who inadvertently gave the idea for this show. Appreciate that. And to everybody else, please send in what you would like us to talk about, and that might save you from having us just babble about whatever. So
You can predict the future episodes by telling us what you want to hear.
yeah,
Otherwise, every 2 weeks is a surprise.
every 2 weeks would be a surprise otherwise. But well, until next time,
All right, cheers, Matt.
cheers.
This is a very tasty one, though. This is good.
I love my IPAs. I'm surprised at how much I liked this. This was great.